from nowhere 5 years ago, China's become the biggest car exporter in the world. Like, if you had told me the yen would be at 150, I would say every car in the world is going to be produced in Japan.
Yep.
But we're moving into a world where every car in the world is going to be produced in China. And, building cars, building nuclear power plants, building railroads, that's complicated stuff.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it's not plastic toys anymore. If China produces more engineers every year than there are engineers in the US, how can we not expect to eventually be bypassed?
Yeah. So you've been a keen observer of China and other emerging markets from your perch in Hong Kong. And let's just get into it. So if I follow the Western media today, they tell me China is collapsing. If I turn on Gavical, I learn, wait a minute, their monthly trade surplus is 80 billion. It's on an annualized run rate, it's $1 trillion trade surplus. If I tune into Steve Shu's podcast, who's interviewing technologists and scientists, I learned that in space, semiconductors, jet engines, electric vehicles, solar panels, they're at parity or beyond parity with the West now in all those areas. So who has the story right?
One of my favorite philosophers, a Christian philosopher of the 16th century, a guy called Jean Baudin, who would say, the only wealth is man. The only wealth is people. When I studied in China in the early 90s, China was graduating 300,000 university students a year. Today, China graduates last year, it's graduated 11.5 million, and this year it's going to graduate about 12.3 million people. That's a 30x in one generation in terms of going to your point about the progress made on semiconductors, the progress made on space, on computers, etc. China now graduates every year more engineers than there are in the United States, than there are engineers in the United States. Now, we could debate all day, yes, but the Chinese universities don't have the same levels as the US universities, and we're comparing apples and oranges, etc. But the point I'd make is 30 years ago, you were graduating 300,000 guys. And even if the 12 million guys you're now graduating are not the same level as your 12 million guys from the University of Michigan or the Harvard that you mentioned or Duke or etc. That's still a whole lot better than plowing fields behind a horse.
Sorry, I was going to say I've been a professor for 30 years, and so I've seen the whole arc of what you described. Where at the beginning, if you wanted to get a world-class science education, at least at the graduate level, you had to leave China and come out here. There were no world-class research labs in China. Fast forward to today, there are many Chinese universities with top flight departments across the board in STEM subjects. And about twice the fraction of kids of that 11 million that you described, the percentage that are doing STEM is twice as high as in the United States. So overall, you just get this enormous tidal wave of human capital that's feeding into their system. And their K through 12 grads are pretty good. So basically now they can get all the way up to world-class frontier, research level training at their domestic universities, which even 10 years ago, they couldn't do that, but now they can. So all the stuff is compounded. You can just see it in how young the teams are over there that are doing this world-class work, whether it's in jet engines or satellites or computers. So that human capital thing is for real. It's not going to go away for decades.
So on this, I completely agree with you. But if I was the US, perhaps one worrying statistic is if you take the very best Chinese universities, your Beida, your Tsinghua, your Fudan, your Nandas, they used to send a lot of university graduates to the US. So you do the undergrads there, and then to your point, you'd come to Michigan to do a master's or a PhD in physics or chemistry or whatever. Those numbers have been in free fall. Now, initially, you thought, okay, it's COVID. Nobody's moving. It's hard to get out of the country, etc. But even post-COVID, there's been no rebound. Now, you could say, well, it's the economic difficulties in China. It's actually, I can now do a very good PhD in chemistry at Tsinghua, which I think is actually what it is. I don't need to spend all this money to go to go. If I'm a top guy, I don't need to spend all this money to go to Michigan. I can go to Tsinghua.
Louis, you went through the pain of having to learn Mandarin. So imagine how painful it would have been for you at 22 to say, oh my God, the only place I can do my PhD in material science is at Tsinghua. And now I got to be fully fluent. I got to read all my textbooks in Mandarin.
Yes.
I got to network with my job recruiter in Mandarin. I got to do everything in Mandarin. there are plenty of people in China that are great scientists, but their English isn't that great. So why would they come here, right? It's such a burden for them to come here that there is an ecosystem for them to develop their skills and to practice what they learned in school. In China, they're obviously going to favor that once the system is mature.
So I think, to your point, I think we've reached that point in China now, and I think that's a change that perhaps we in the Western world underestimate, because we just take it for granted that we have the best universities in the world, and that, of course, if you're smart, you want to go to Harvard, and of course, once you're in Harvard, you're never going to move back to China, because why would you? And because, in fairness, that was always the case for 100 years, or at least the post-World War II environment. That was the case. And I don't know if it still is. I don't know if it's still the case in the past.
I think it's just tipping now. So, and obviously for the bulk of students who they don't necessarily have the choice of going to Stanford or Tsinghua, but it's some other good Chinese university and then some other, reasonably good U.S. university. I think they're much more likely to stay in China now than they were even a few years ago.
So I think that's, to answer your question, that's the first point I wanted to highlight, because again, I think it's perhaps people aren't aware of it in the Western world. Now, the second point I'd make, on the whole, China's imploding, and is, what I find fascinating is, in my career, so I'm 50 years old, but in my career, basically every time you've had a real estate bust, you had a big economic implosion. Banks, went belly up, and you had big rises in unemployment and big deflationary busts in your economy. And that was the case for Japan in the early 90s. That was the case, we mentioned it that was the case in Sweden in 92, in Canada in 94. It was the case all across Southeast Asia in 97. Obviously, the US in 2008 is still fresh in a lot of people's mind. Or frankly, Southern Europe in 2011, 2012. Real estate has now been consolidating in China for 4 or 5 years, for a number of reasons. Obviously, trees don't grow to the sky, but also the government actively wanted to take down real estate. They took down real estate. Affordability has gone from, being the most expensive in 20 years to the cheapest in 20 years over the past 5 years. Partly because mortgage rates have halved, partly because real estate prices have gone down about 20, 30%. And at the same time, over that same 5-year period, incomes have come up 20, 30%. So, you do your affordability ratio, all of a sudden it looks much better. And so China has managed to do a real estate consolidation, which has, hurt growth, which has killed the sort of like raw feeling the Chinese economy had. But the Chinese economy has not imploded. The show's kept on the road. You haven't had armies of unemployed showing up in cities looking for work. Nobody's gone hungry. You haven't had a fentanyl crisis. It's like the economy has been adjusting for the past 4 or 5 years to a different economy, in fairness. But I think we have the knee-jerk reaction in the Western world of, oh, there's been a real estate bubble. The real estate bubble is imploding. Therefore, it's all going to go to pot. Therefore, everything's going to implode, because that's what happened to us. So how could it not happen to them? Right? I mean, we're just projecting our own experiences onto China.
I think you wanted to say that manufacturers and high-tech companies in China are competing against a very weak yen, yet they're taking market share, have huge trade surpluses. And so it's obviously
exactly
for anybody else to try to compete with Japan is extremely hard. And the fact that they could do it tells you something, right?
Exactly. So when you think of it, they've had to deal with a super cheap yen, the real estate bust we mentioned. And on top of that, the American
war
restrictions on war. For any but semiconductor restrictions and whatever else. And with that, from nowhere 5 years ago, China's become the biggest car exporter in the world. Like, if you had told me the yen would be at 150, I would say every car in the world is going to be produced in Japan. But we're moving into a world where every car in the world is going to be produced in China, because not only are they good at producing cheap internal combustion engine cars, but they've basically, at this point, they've cornered the electric car market. And Europe is waking up to this, because Europe was saying, oh, by 2030, we want every new car sold to be electric. And they're realizing, hold on, if we do that, that means that we want every new car sold to be Chinese. And, which creates issues. So, but beyond electric cars, you got railways, you got power plants, turbines. I mean, you name it. 5 years ago, You mentioned that China's trade surplus has gone from 25 billion a month to 75 or 80 billion a month. And again, that's not because you and I decided to buy 3 times as many pairs of socks or 3 times as many, plastic toys.
Yep.
In the past 5 years, China started exporting a bunch of stuff they never exported before. Right now, China's in negotiations with Saudi Arabia to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear power plants. Now, as a Frenchman, I look at this and I wonder what the hell just happened here. Like, selling nuclear power plants is our business. That's what we do in France. That's like one of our key comparative advantages. And China comes in and undercuts us by 2/3. Sorry, they come in at 2/3 of our price, so undercut us by 1/3. It's mind blowing. And building cars, building nuclear power plants, building railroads. That's complicated stuff, right? I mean, again, it's not plastic toys anymore.
When I talk to Americans, a lot of the most anti-China people, they want to say, okay, this is all stolen. You guys stole all this IP and technology. And I'm sure some of that happened. But even if you stole stuff without a very powerful human capital and tech infrastructure basis, you're not going to be able to compete across all these different industries going forward. If all they did was steal and you stop them from stealing, you're going to get back ahead of them. But it looks the other way. It looks like they're getting ahead of us now. So very different from how it's perceived here.
I hate the stealing of IP argument, to be honest. It's sort of one of my bugbears. I always say, okay, look, China's become the biggest EV producer in the world. Like, what did they steal? From whom?
Yeah, Tesla buys their batteries from them, right? So,
yeah. Tesla buys their. It's like, who did they steal and from whom to do this? Now, you could say they stole it from Tesla, but actually, Tesla early on in its life said, I'm putting everything up there on the web, everything we've done, and anybody can look at it because we want the world to move to an electric car format. Like, who did they steal to do this? Nuclear power plant, they build their own nuclear program from scratch. Like, this is, it's really hard to steal nuclear stuff because of all the national security around it, etc. So, like, if we want to say China stole the nuclear secrets, then that means that we've got some serious espionage leaks going on in our own countries.
To be honest, when I talk to people like that, I don't even want to fight that battle. I'll just say, look, let's suppose they stole everything, but they have very competent people making use of what they stole. And going forward, just crying about it is not going to solve your problem because they're innovating new stuff, as with EVs, as you pointed out, right? So, or LiDAR or something.
And it goes back to what we were saying a little while ago. It's like, look, if China produces more engineers every year than there are engineers in the US, how can we not expect to eventually be bypassed?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's to say, oh, they're just stealing stuff. It's like, so what are all these people doing? These literally millions of engineers that are getting churned out every year.
Yep.